Ooh, I'm excited for this video. Near the end of last year, I covered this guy right here. This is the B-Link GTR6, an absolute phenomenal mini PC that has been my primary desktop Linux box since. And the reason I'm excited is because we are upgrading this right here is the GTR 7, featuring some major improvements with the performance, some drastic I/O changes here on the back, such as removing 3 of the 4 HDMIs that were on the GTR 6 and replacing it with a DisplayPort and 2 more USB-C connections. This GTR 7 here has the new 7000 series of AMD mobile CPUs, delivering absolutely wild gaming performance without needing a dedicated GPU. So in this video, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the gaming performance, some of the new hardware, and what this machine actually delivers, and talk about why this platform of mini PCs is still my choice for daily computing. But before we move on, we need to thank the sponsor of this video, ProArc, and their 2-in-1 HubMouse. I've been using ProArc's products and peripherals for well over a year, and they have been absolutely fantastic. And just about a month ago, they sent over the HubMouse here, and it has proven to be quite useful. Now, not only do we have the basic functionalities that you'd expect off of a mouse like this, but you have this built into the mouse. This is a small USB hub featuring an HDMI that supports 4K 30Hz, a USB 3, and another Type-C supporting power input up to 60 watts. Now this thing is awesome, especially if you have a device that unfortunately isn't a framework laptop and you only have a couple USB-Cs to work with. To hide away the hub, you just slide it on in and you are good to go. When it comes to the actual connectivity of the mouse functionality, you have dual Bluetooth and you can connect with the Type-C here on the front. Now, if you're interested in checking out the HubMouse, it will be the first link down below. So I'm going to go ahead and put this away for now. I'm probably going to be whipping that out for the LTX Expo. I'm going to be doing an interview possibly with one of my favorite creators, so looking forward to that. So now, before we dive into the hardware and specifications, let's talk about what is outside of the machine, and that is our I/O. On top here, we have the GTR 6. On bottom, we have the GTR 7. And you can see here when it comes to the front, there are not really any significant changes. I mean, some of the coloring is a little bit different, and this will depend on the actual color you pick of the GTR 7. We have our power button, we have our clear BIOS button, a USB, a USB-C, headphone jack, and then some difference in branding here. I always thought the GTR 6 was a little interesting because they made the power button red and the clear BIOS button green. The GTR 7 is a little more toned down on the coloring of the buttons. The GTR 7 still has some stickers though, but they are on the bottom here. And you can see we have the 7000 series as well as the Radeon sticker. Now, one thing you probably noticed looking on the bottom here is we have a rather interesting port right here. That is the DC power, which has changed from your standard kind of DC plug on the GTR 6. This is a magnetic kind of proprietary one. There are definitely some pros and cons to this. The kind of specialized proprietary port thing is never really good, but I do kind of like how it just magnets on here and hangs out the bottom. You're not going to have really issues of it coming unplugged or anything like that, so it's good in that regard. This right here is the cord, 19 volts. You can see we got the brick on the actual plug instead of somewhere randomly in the middle. Personally, I prefer that for desktop units. I absolutely hate when they do that with servers because of how I have things set up, but I do like that it's a little more low profile than the last one. And like I said, the back of this unit is where we have some of the big changes. The GTR 6 had 4 HDMI ports, which I frankly thought was cool in a way, but kind of silly. Most people do not have quad monitor displays, and sometimes actually having all 4 of these was kind of glitchy. I had to like switch them every once in a while. It was kind of a weird situation. They dropped 3 of them, and now we only have a single HDMI and a display port out. Because now there's a little more space on the back, we actually have 2 new USB-Cs, which is fantastic because now you have room to plug in a dock, some other peripheral, or something that requires USB-C on the back. So you have 2 of them, 1 on the front. When it comes to that, connectivity is awesome. And not just that, they did one of my favorite things, and that is including dual LAN. That is really good if you want to set this up as some kind of server unit down the road. And these LANs are 2.5 gigabit, meaning they are incredibly fast and much better than the kind of standard 1 gigabit port that you see on most devices. Now, like with most of these GTR computers, we have a fingerprint reader on the top. The top did change. This is now a plastic mesh instead of the kind of fabric-y mesh that we got previously, which I think the fabric is cool, but after using it for a couple months, you'll notice you can see where the fan is because of the trapped dust. I end up having to pull this off every once in a while, blow it out. I mean, you should do that anyways, but being able to notice it like this is not the most aesthetically pleasing thing in the world. These GTR devices don't really get much points when it comes to easy upgradability. It's definitely not a Menace form where you could go click click and it just pops open for you, or even an Ace Magician where like the side of the machines just easily pop off. You do have to unscrew all 4 screws on the bottom. That will expose a fan and a little heat sink for the SSDs, which is nice. It does definitely keep it cooler, but then to actually unscrew this, you have to kind of get a small skinny screwdriver like this to actually get in there and unscrew the screws in it. And then when you pull that open, you could actually see what's inside the computer and all the different upgradability options that you're going to have. And now is a fantastic time to talk a little bit more about these specifications. First, here we have our system memory. The unit I have here shipped with dual SO-DIMM at 32 gigabytes. This is DDR5 memory. So you can see the 2 crucial sticks we have here. Additionally, we have 2 spots for a M.2 NVMe drive. The one I got was a PCIe 4.01 terabyte SSD. And right now I have Windows on this, and I do plan on throwing another drive in there specifically for Linux. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. And then here we have our little Wi-Fi card. This is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2 is what is supported. And that's about it when it comes to our upgradability options. So now we need to talk about the most important thing, and that is the actual CPU that comes in this unit. And we're going to do a brief comparison to the GTR 6 here. The GTR 6 here shipped with the Ryzen 9 6900, and this one has the Ryzen 7 7800 mobile CPU. They both came out roughly a year apart, and despite the 7 versus 9 thing, they do both have 8 cores. But really, that is the main similarity. The newer 7800 model has a 4% higher turbo boost frequency at 5.1 versus 4.9, which is crazy. We're getting above 5 gigahertz in these things. Plus, this one has a base frequency advantage of about 0.5 gigahertz. Now, of course, to show some of the differences between these two CPUs, I did run some benchmarks. Starting with Geekbench, the GTR 6 scored just under 2200 and the GTR 7 scored just under 2600 on single core performance. Just for comparison's sakes, I threw in a higher end Intel mobile mini PC, the Nook 13 Pro, and that was right in between both of them with the single core performance at just under 2500. And at least on Geekbench and only Geekbench, it kind of preferred the Ryzen 9 versus the Ryzen 7 on the newer model, giving the GTR 6 about a 9800, the GTR 7 about a 9100, and Intels generally do really good with Geekbench benchmarking, going above 10,000. Now, this is really only true in Geekbench, as when we loaded up Cinebench, the GTR 6 scored about above a 12,000 in multi-core, and the GTR 7 scored about 15,000 or 15,500 in the multi-core performance. The GTR 6 with the Ryzen 9 did do barely better than the GTR 7, with the Ryzen 7 on single core scores with just a difference of about 30 points. And then we got some graphics testing numbers between these. The main selling factor of Ryzen mobile GPUs like this is how well gaming performance does without needing a dedicated GPU. It is truly surprising. And for this, I'm going to match some of the tests I did on the previous model so that we can compare. For the first game that we could compare, we have Elden Ring. This one saw a performance jump of about 5 frames per second at running 1080p medium. On the GTR 6 averaged about 35, and we were getting about 40 on the GTR 7. From there, I loaded up Fall Guys, and this was a substantial improvement in performance, with the GTR 6 ranging between 75 and 85 frames a second, and the GTR 7 ranging from 100 to 150 frames per second. And then where we saw the least difference was in Call of Duty, the newest one, where on the GTR 6 we got an average of 50 to 80 frames, and on the GTR 7 we got about 60 to 80. So the top frame didn't increase, but the bottom level is where we saw some of the improvements. Now, all of those tests were in Windows, so what I did was loaded up Linux, specifically Fedora, and one of my favorite games, Splitgate. This one, we don't have a comparison to the GTR 6, but on the GTR 7 at 1080p, we were seeing anywhere from 120 to 150 frames per second, and then bumping it up to 1440p, we saw about 70 to 90 frames per second. Now, based on your guys' feedback, I actually invested in some extra equipment to do some testing. And the first one is a dB meter under load, so whether that be gaming or running something like Cinebench, we saw roughly 60 decibels for the max volume, which you can definitely hear if you're sitting right next to your computer. It's not that loud, and under idle, it's basically completely silent. And then when it comes to the actual power consumption or wattage that it's going to be pulling from the wall under load, so gaming, running Cinebench, something like that, it usually hovered around 100, reaching up to 107 watts while I was playing Fall Guys, and it was getting about 150 frames per second. And then the power under absolutely no load, maybe one web browser tab, we saw it sitting about 12 watts. So this thing does definitely have a pretty good range when it comes to the power consumption. And the crazy thing with all of this isn't even the highest tier model. They actually have a GTR 7 Pro that's available, which of course has a Ryzen 9, will perform even better. I wish they would have sent that one. But it's okay. This one's a little more realistic when it comes to pricing. This is, I think, about $800 right now, which is really good for getting into a piece of hardware that works this well. Pretty soon here, I'm going to tear this down, put a new NVMe in it so I could dual boot Windows and Linux, best of both worlds here. What distro? What distro should I put on it? That is my real question, because I'm loving Debian right now, but then I'll have to use the back ports. Do you guys have any suggestions? Norbrara hasn't updated in forever. I don't know. What should I do? With all that, there'll be a link to this down below. I do hope you have an absolutely beautiful day, and goodbye.